Sometimes a story from our childhood returns to our memory at just the right moment. Or at least that was the case for me this last week. When I was about 8 or 9, I recall giggling at a story about a man who went to see the movies, and upon seeing the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Roaring Lion, decided that he'd already seen that movie and walked out of the theater. Don't get me wrong, it still makes me laugh too. But after reading the story of the prodigal son again this week, it also served as an important lesson. I mean, anytime a story begins with the words, "a man had 2 sons," there's a good chance I've heard that story before. Or at the very least, I can predict how it ends. After all, I grew up in such a family. I am the younger of 2 brothers. I know how that story goes. Not to mention I have 2 children of my own, and while they're not brothers, what they say to one another is exactly the same. Recently, it was with regard to a chicken wing. We often get some to accompany our pizza on Friday nights. Clara discovered long ago that they weren't exactly her cup of tea. Harrison, on the other hand, loves them. So we were watching a movie, enjoying our pizza and wings, when Clara cries out, "Hey, I want a chicken wing." I said, "Clara, you don't even like chicken wings." To which she replied, "That's not the point, Daddy. Harrison has one." I can suspect many of you can identify. You don't need to come from a multi-sibling family to know this story. No, you only need to be human to experience it. We've been waiting in line an hour. They can't just cut in line and get in before us. I had my turn signal on, waiting to get into that parking spot. You can't take that from me. What do you mean you just gave away the last piece of pie? That was mine. I don't understand. It's not fair. In fact, it's such a universal experience, it's tempting for all of us to hear those initial words of the parable of the prodigal son and think to ourselves, "Oh yeah, I've heard that one before," and then start thinking about that piece of pie after worship today. After all, we all know that we're like that elder brother in this story, aren't we? Or maybe it just has to do with the congregations with which I've been associated. My experience is that the church is filled with the sort of responsible brothers and sisters who pay the bills on time, call their parents on a regular basis, change the oil in their cars before that light comes on. Or maybe that's just me. Regardless, when you live like the elder brother, there's a good chance you live with a particular set of expectations, or at least a kind of worldview where, well, things add up. You count, you quantify, you measure, you compare and the like, all in an effort at fairness, which is a reasonable goal. We all want equity, justice, balance. You put in your time, you get the promotion, you follow the rules, you stay out of trouble, you do good things will come to you. In fact, this kind of thinking reveals itself in most theologies, in all the religions. Sort of like what we call karma, culturally speaking today. You know, what goes around comes around. If something bad happens to you, well, that just means you haven't been living right. If what you prayed for didn't unfold well, then you must not have been praying hard enough. Even common Christian teaching on atonement seems to be articulated this way. We have sin that demands God's punishment. Jesus is righteous and can take that punishment for us. So by dying on the cross, we're forgiven and reconciled to God. If you think about it, it's an accountant's dream. A plus B equals C. In fact, in the first century, the phrase, "a man had 2 sons," was a common way to tell a story with this particular equation in mind. Even Matthew does so in his gospel. A man had 2 sons, one who promises to work in the vineyard but never shows up, and another who at first adamantly refuses to go to the vineyard but later repents and goes. Which one did the will of the Father, Jesus asks. Not the one who talked a good game, but the one who actually followed through with obedient action. You see, it's Simple math, really. Basic arithmetic. A rudimentary calculation. It all simply adds up. Except that is for Luke. In fact, if I were to guess, Luke likely had Matthew's story about those two sons in the vineyard right in front of him as he transcribed Jesus' telling of the parable of the prodigal son. After all, Luke seems to want to convey a very different kind of truth from Matthew. One that deep down we don't want to believe, and yet we all know is so very true. And that is that, well, life just doesn't really work this way, does it? As desperately as we try to make our lives out in straightforward equations, the truth is, at least by our calculations, there's a lot more that's irrational than rational. A lot more that doesn't compute than actually adds up. A lot more that's seemingly unfair than is fair. At least that's my experience, almost on a daily basis. I raised both my children the same. Why is it that one came to be a lawyer and the other a drug addict? The car accident was my fault. Why did I survive and the other driver die? I go to church every Sunday, give way beyond my means, volunteer at the local soup kitchen. How could this happen to me? There isn't much that I remember now about reading those books on raising children, which I read before having our first child, Harrison. Although there is one bit of wisdom that always has stuck out with me. Specifically, it was in a book about being a father. Toward the end of the book, the author reflected on having multiple grown children and some of the bits of wisdom he picked up from his experiences along the way. He wrote something to this effect, and I'm paraphrasing here. Throughout their childhood, my children's favorite words were some version of, "It's not fair." And there were days they convinced me that this was true. But I always tried to distinguish between equality and fairness. What I did for my children may not have always been equal, but I certainly hope it was fair. I got in my car on Friday to drive back to Atlanta from Indiana after being with my mom for her surgery and recovery this week. When I turned the ignition on, news came over the radio about the funerals that had begun for victims of the mosque shootings that took place in New Zealand last week. I'd been praying for a lot of things leading up to that moment, like for safe travels and for my family's safety while I was away, and of course for my mom, the doctors and nurses caring for her. And while I wanted God's full attention for just a couple of days, I know God's presence, love, and grace was needed in New Zealand and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, in very different ways. Ways I could never fathom or even begin to understand. Or at least I hope God's love and presence wasn't equal in that moment. Although I always trust it's fair. My son, the father said, "You're always with me. Everything I have is yours." It sounds nice in theory, but isn't always an easy pill to swallow, I realize. Especially when it comes to thinking about our God. And yet these are Jesus' teachings over and over again. Like the manager who pays the same wages to the vineyard workers who work all day and those who only show up at the end of the day. Or when Jesus blesses the poor and the grief-stricken, the despised, but sends woe upon the rich, the happy, and the well-respected. Or when he says things like, "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last." Flannery O'Connor's short story Revelation speaks to this truth. Ruby Turpin is an outlandishly self-satisfied, upper-class woman who spends most of the story judging and belittling the African Americans and who she calls trashy white folks around her, congratulating herself and thanking God that she's not one of them. Ruby experiences a few traumatic events, and at the end she has a vision that shows her the kingdom of heaven doesn't always look the way she had imagined it. At sunset, she looks up and there's a purple streak in the sky. O'Connor writes, she saw the streak as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from earth through a field of living fire. Upon it, a vast horde of souls were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives, and bands of black slaves in white robes, and battalions of freaks and lunatics, and shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized as once as those who, like her and her husband Claude, had always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned in to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they always had been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key. And yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. This certainly makes things messier, I know. But when it comes to relationships, isn't it all a mess? Both our relationship with God and one another. I mean, there's nothing simple and straightforward or easy calculated about love. Let me put it this way. Do you count every good thing your spouse does for you and use that as a judge as to how much they love you? Do you keep track of every unhelpful or hurtful thing your friends might do to you and demand payment for them? Even worse, do you expect to make payment to your children for every mistake you make as a parent? Which makes me wonder if I don't know this story as well as I thought I did. I mean, what if this story isn't so much about the elder brother or even the so-called prodigal son? What if this story isn't about you and me? What if in the end this story is simply about God? I remember reading a Dennis the Menace cartoon in which Dennis and his little friend Joey are leaving Mrs. Wilson's house, hands full of cookies. Joey says, I wonder what we did to deserve these cookies. Dennis answers, look, Joey, Mrs. Wilson gives us cookies not because we're nice, but because she's nice. Notice every theological question I've asked about fairness up to this point is about what we've done or haven't done or will do to deserve this grace and love and blessing from God. But what if in this story we're not the subject and God is? What if this story begins with a father had two sons but is really about two sons who had a father? What if this story isn't about a prodigal son at all, but is in fact about a prodigal God? The truth is, while that may not be what we want, in the end, isn't that what we need? I know I do. Because as much as I like to believe I'm the elder brother, I've squandered it all before. I've hurt those I love most. I've let people down. I've made a mess of things. And I will do it again. I am human, after all. So thanks be to God that I don't know this story as well as I thought. And thanks be to God that it's not fair.